Hello everyone, this is Mark from the Smoky Mountains Station. We're a group of Chinese expatriates living in the United States, and we are part of the whistleblower movement. We would like to tell you in this short story about the origin of COVID-19 virus, the virus that's causing the global pandemic right now. We want to tell you that this virus is indeed coming from China, but it's not China virus, it's not Chinese virus. We have strong reason to believe it should be called the Chinese Communist Party virus or the CCP virus. Let me show you the reason for that. For one thing, if you pay attention to the numbers of the people infected in the United States, you may realize that Asian Americans, especially Chinese Americans, in terms of the number of cases are disproportionately low, either in the number of infections or the number of fatalities. Well, you could say that Asian Americans tends to be more cautious. That could be one of the reasons, but there's another important reason in that a lot of Chinese Americans have already heard of this virus and its potential danger very early before it even came to the United States. As early as January 19th, a Chinese media called Lude Media has already reported the virus and its extreme infectiousness and its danger, and warned the Chinese community. And we try to tell this to the other American friends, but a lot of them were like Dr. Fauci and like the politicians at the time. They are quite dismissive. They think that this is not a big deal. It's not going to spread in the United States. But rather, what we heard from the Chinese media is that the Chinese, of course, not the state-controlled media, and they try to do everything they can to hide the truth. But rather, from the whistleblower movement, we heard that this virus would very much likely to come from a bioweapon program in China, and it's highly dangerous to general population, and it is going to cause a pandemic. And first, let me show you the timeline and also give you some new information about why we think this is coming from the bioweapon program. As early as December, in China, in Wuhan city, a doctor named Zhang Jixian has identified people, especially family clusters, that were infected with coronavirus. This is a clear indication that there's people-to-people transmission, because otherwise, how could a whole family get infected altogether? At the beginning, as you recall, the Chinese Communist Party tried to blame the wet market. They were saying that people in Wuhan eat bats. And I happen to have many friends from Wuhan, and people there never eat bats. And they try to say this is from the wet market. It just jumps species from animal to human, and it's not going to be infectious between humans. But about at the highest level in CCP, or Chinese Communist Party, the party members start to take hydrochloroquine or HCQ regularly as a preventative measure. And now, as you can see, there are very few, or there's zero party members that's high up has been diagnosed as of COVID-19. And that's part of the reason people were taking HCQ at the time. And you probably also heard the story about the hero, Dr. Limeng Yan, who has warned his friends privately to say that there's people-to-people transmission. But at the time, CCP was doing everything it can, trying to hide the story, trying to tell the world that everything is fine, everything is under control. This is just an incident that the virus jumps species, it doesn't pass to other people. So Dr. Li, because he warned other people, trying to warn them about the danger of this virus, he was taken by force to the police station, and he was required to sign a document promising that he's not going to say anything anymore. And in the meantime, WHO was fully cooperative with the CCP. They tell the world everything was fine. But one thing is that on December 31st, Taiwan, the CDC of Taiwan actually warned WHO about the potential human-to-human transmission, and WHO fully discounted that information. And then as I mentioned, on January 19th, the Chinese language media, Lude Media, Lude is a very well-known YouTuber or broadcaster within the whistleblower movement. He has 174,000 followers, and he told the fellow Chinese in the US, don't believe anything the CCP have said. And this is going to cause a global pandemic. At the time, most people, including our American friends, don't believe that's the case. They think there's no human-to-human transmission because they trust the Chinese state media, they trust WHO. They think that's going to be controlled in Wuhan city, but it's not. And also at the time, Lude mentioned that this virus, based on its genome, this is very likely to have leaked from the PLA Lab, and it should be resulted from the bioweapon program under CCP. And at that time, a lot of Chinese expatriates in the United States start to pay close attention and have been very careful about trying to protect themselves. And we also try to educate others, but it's very hard to convince everyone around us. But now we have more and more evidence that's surfacing, and we really want to give a dire warning to everyone. Now, after January 19th, right after this, China started to acknowledge the fact that there is human-to-human transmission. But by the time they acknowledge it, maybe prompted by Lude has disclosed this story, between the time they know there's human-to-human transmission to the time they tell the world about this, there's already a month has passed. And also another interesting thing is they locked down Wuhan, basically banning anyone from leaving the city into another Chinese city, but they still allow people to fly overseas from Wuhan airport, which is a very big international airport. So that accounted for a lot of the initial international transmission. And another interesting thing is that February 8th, a major general in the People's Liberation Army, the name is Wei Chen, she took over PLA Lab in Wuhan, and why was she there? Why would you think a Chinese bioweapon expert would immediately take PLA Lab when they see things are out of control? She was there to destroy the evidence based on our inside information. And as you recall, the CCP was trying to blame the wet market, blaming the Chinese people there eating bat was the primary cause for the virus. And what's interesting was instead of going there, make full detailed inspection, they cleaned the wet market twice. They even used disinfectant throughout the wet market. Why are they doing that? It's like trying to destroy all the evidence rather than making sincere investigations. And things gets more and more, as you know, it's very hard to hide something, unless you didn't do it, something would eventually going to come out. Fortunately, we have a distinguished scientist, Dr. Limeng Yan. She was an insider of a P3 lab, and she has close connection with mainland China because the P3 lab in Hong Kong has close collaboration with the P4 lab in Wuhan. And she's the primary Chinese-speaking, Mandarin-speaking person, expert, that has maintained very close communication with the mainland China labs. She has done 2 separate independent investigations of the virus. And she realized that how dangerous the virus is. And she also doesn't agree with how the CCP was trying to cover this up. And it turned out, starting from January 18th, she has been communicating with Mr. Lu De and provided all this information, and the whistleblower movement arranged to have her fled from Hong Kong to the United States. And finally, in the recent weeks, Dr. Yan has had a few interviews with Fox News, accusing Beijing of covering up COVID-19. And more recently, in the past couple of days, Dr. Yan has been appearing on a radio show named War on Pandemic, providing even more information supporting her claim in terms of not only Beijing was trying to cover up, was trying to help this virus to infect the world, but also this is coming from a bioweapon program under People's Liberation Army. Now, who is Dr. Yan, and why should we believe in her? Dr. Yan is a frontline researcher and a distinguished scientist in the P3 Lab in Hong Kong. And the P3 Lab is a WHO reference lab. So they basically maintain a direct interaction with WHO. And Dr. Yan has both medical doctor's degree as well as a PhD degree. And she does research in terms of both the virus as well as the virus infection on animals. And her supervisor or the director of the lab include Dr. Malik Paris. And Malik is one of the most distinguished experts in virology. And she's the director of that P3 Lab. And also working with him is Dr. Liu Peng, who is also a very famous expert. And another interesting connection for Dr. Yan is that Dr. Yan is married to a Sri Lanka scientist, and her husband has very close interaction with Malik, the director of the lab, because he's the one that they both come from the same country, and he's the only one that Malik trusts the most. That's why between Dr. Yan and her husband, they hold a lot of information about the research in the P3 Lab, the interaction between the P3 Lab and P4 labs, as well as the information about direct communication between the Wuhan lab and Hong Kong. And there's no question also that Dr. Yan and her husband are expert in this field because they work on these viruses every day. So now let's talk about why this COVID-19 virus is likely to be designed to be a bioweapon rather than, what people think. Generally the media discount the story of the virus leaking from a bioweapon program. They discount it because they say, it's likely to come from an intermediate species. If it's not directly coming from the bat, which is very unlikely, then there's an intermediate. For example, the Chinese government, the CCP, now is trying to blame on pangolin as the intermediate animal that hosted the virus before it passed on to human. And even if it's leaking from the lab, now this story has been fully discounted, but then if it's coming from the lab, most of the media would say, oh, this is coming from a vaccine program. Rather, maybe the CCP was trying to develop a vaccine for SARS, and inevitably they got something that's truly bad. But this is not likely. According to Dr. Yan, if you were trying to design a vaccine, you would try to make it less harmful. You would try to make it mild. But in this case, they are weaponizing this. They are making this virus extremely dangerous. And also, unlike what the so-called bat woman in the Wuhan P4 lab, because she was pressured by many people saying, whether the virus has came out of your lab because you are the expert on bat viruses. And she basically came out with a publication in January saying that there's a RATG13 virus from Yunnan province, and that's likely to be the origin of COVID-19. but it takes a few decades between this RATG13 to COVID-19. So there has to be an intermediate host, but nobody knows what it is. And this has been debunked and questioned by a number of scientists, including Dr. Yan. She said, based on their scientific knowledge, RATG13 is basically a fake virus. They just reported the sequence, and the sequence is just made up because they don't have a sample right now. Even Dr. Shi Zhengli, the Batwoman, acknowledged that they don't have the virus sample. They only have the sequence, which is a bunch of letters that anybody can make up, even a 5-year-old. But as early as January, there's another Chinese researcher, as well as Dr. Yan, has rightfully pointed out that the backbone of the virus was from the so-called Zhoushan bat virus. And that virus, that bat, typically coming from the east coast of China, whereas the RATG13, which is the fake virus, was claimed to be coming from Yunnan province. These two places at least 1,000 miles away from each other. So the backbone of the virus is the Zhoushan bat virus, and this is owned by the People's Liberation Army, or PLA. And if we compare the difference between the Zhoushan bat virus and the COVID-19, you will see that all these small differences are just intended to make this virus more dangerous and more infectious to humans. So let's look at the differences. For one, it has a recombinant RBD with potent attachment to human ACE2 acceptor. What essentially it says here is that the protein on the top of the prong has very high binding energy to the human cell's receptor, so that the virus can easily infect people and go into human cells. And also, what's interesting is that there's a very unique foreign cleavage site that enhance the stability of this S protein on the top to make sure that it's very robust and can survive for a long time and infect people very, very efficiently. So imagine if you are designing a vaccine, why would you make it so dangerous rather than, you would want it to be more mild and more safe? And in fact, there's Chinese publication early on from Chinese researchers has already pointed out that the virus behaves very similar to some of the most dangerous viruses like HIV and Ebola. And a lot of its behavior, it's not very similar to SARS, even though this is called SARS-CoV-2 and it's the same family of coronavirus, but it's much, much more dangerous and much, much more infectious. But if you recall at the time, early January, CCP has always claimed that this is not infectious and we don't have much concern about it. And while they are releasing all the travelers from Wuhan to all of the world, and while swapping up all the PPEs, the masks, and remember all the struggles at the beginning when the pandemic occurred in the United States. Now I want to show you a little bit more about Dr. Yan's recent discussion about the virus. I strongly recommend you to look at her Fox News interview. And at the time, she went over the timeline. And because she was the person who was in charge of 2 separate investigations commissioned by her supervisor, and remember that they are a WHO reference lab, so they are obliged to investigate any outbreak of viruses in Asia, and they have to report immediately to WHO. So she reported all her findings, including the cover-up by the CCP and everything else, to her boss. And her boss would have the obligation to report to WHO, but WHO didn't say anything. They just dismissed all the people-to-people transmission. They are fully complicit with the Chinese Communist Party in terms of helping the virus to spread all over the world. And in fact, Dr. Yan mentioned that she was personally warned by her supervisor 3 times in 3 separate occasions, saying that you don't want to talk too much. There are certain red lines by CCP. If you speak too much, you may be disappear, which means you could be thrown into prison and nobody gets to talk to you anymore. And also, Dr. Yan mentioned 2 days ago that she's preparing a very comprehensive scientific report to convince the community, the scientific community, as well as the general public, that how easily this can be done in the lab. I quote her. She said, if I have the PLA's backbone protein, this virus can be made through gain-of-function experiment within half a year, just by herself. Imagine. And over the past couple of days, Dr. Yan has provided more and more information. And she mentioned that we realize that American publics are sometimes naive in terms of dealing with CCP. They couldn't believe that a communist regime can be so evil. But I can tell you from someone with my background or our background in terms of growing up in China, we can see a lot of the things that CCP was doing. You know, we can, even at the beginning, it's hard for us to believe, but when we think about our experience and Cultural Revolution and all the sufferings caused by the Communist Party, we think, oh, these are potentially reasonable, and things start to pan out exactly like what what Lu De was saying and Dr. Yan was saying. Everything so far has proven that they are right, and CCP and WHO were wrong. So I would strongly recommend you to look at the War Room videos on Dr. Yan, and because she has the first-hand experience about the virus, and she mentioned that you know, in order to cover up, early January, the CCP basically directed the researchers in China to upload wrong genome sequence, which is the signature of the virus and which is the most critical information about the virus. For more than 3 times, they provide wrong genome sequence until the time that they realize that in Thailand people are infected and they fear that the right sequence would be uploaded by another government, and then they decide to upload the right sequence. And she also provided tons of valuable information related to virus today, including that, you know, in her P3 lab in Hong Kong, they have a lot of collaboration with China. They deal with a lot of very dangerous viruses that's not supposed to be done in their lab, and some of the parts were linked with some of the CCP's bioweapon program. For example, she said her husband directly worked with West Nile virus, that you're not supposed to do it in P3 lab, you have to do it in P4 lab. And between the two of them, they have gone through the genome sequence of the COVID-19 virus very early on when it was uploaded, and also through her communication with the Chinese colleagues. Both her and her husband are fully convinced that the virus is man-made. And another information is that she mentioned her boss, Malik, the top expert in virus field and the director of the WHO reference lab, retired shortly after she fled Hong Kong. This is very interesting. She also mentioned that her advisor recently just got $27 million research funding from Hong Kong government. Why would he retire as soon as he find out Dr. Yan has fled and is trying to spill the beans on the Chinese Communist Party? This basically shows you that the CCP and the WHO are fully cooperating in terms of covering up this terrible, terrible incident. With that, I hope I have shown you some interesting and helpful information. And according to Dr. Yan, there's a lot of things that we still don't know about the virus. It's extremely dangerous, very infectious, even though the fatality rate is relatively low, but there are a lot of potential side effects and consequences that people have to protect them and just be careful. And I hope everyone and their family stay safe. And also we want to say that we, the people from China, we are your friends. We want to show you and protect you and show you the evil nature of the CCP. And really, they are in our way. Imagine if they told us, if they warned Dr. Fauci and President Trump that the virus was so contagious and dangerous and it was leaked from the lab, the whole thing would be much better controlled now rather than having a few million people, 4 million people infected in the States and over 15 million infected worldwide. Together, we want to fight with you. We want to share more information with you. So this is to be continued.